Hey everyone, welcome back to the Maximum Human Potential YouTube channel. Now, I'm just going to do a quick video on one of my pet peeves, which is stimulus addiction. So, not stimulant addiction, stimulus addiction. Now, this was a word a phrase really coined by Christian Thibodeau, who's a very well-respected strength coach from Canada. Now, Christian, so he uses the word stimulus addiction, stimulus addict, to describe someone who takes pride in how much training they do rather than the results they're getting from that training. So these are the people, you talk to them, you see them in the gym, and you'll be like, oh, how's your training going, man? And they're like, yeah, I'm training 6 days a week, 2 hours per session, I'm doing cardio, I'm doing weights, I'm doing daily undulating periodization, I'm doing these bodybuilding assistance exercises, I'm doing some west side max effort lifts, I'm doing bands, I'm doing chains. And whenever they hear of something new, they'll chuck it back in there. And they'll do that new exercise. You know, they're always looking to add, what can I add into my program? You know, what's the next assistance exercise I can do? If 3 sets is good, 10 must be better. How much work can I do during the week? And their whole life revolves around getting all this training in. You know, spending hours in, they're constantly fatigued, they're constantly sore, there's always these niggles and injuries that are coming up. And they hate it when they have to have a day off and something comes up that disrupts their obsessive regime. Now, in reality, we should be completely ignore how much we're doing. You know, that should be very, very low down our list of priorities, or even non-existent. That should be, not even a consideration. The only consideration should be, what results are we actually getting from this training, and how do we optimize the amount of training I do to get the results you want? So this needs to be, you got to be realistic here. What's your work schedule like? What's your sleep like? What's your diet like? And how much control do you actually have over those factors? Have you got kids? Have you got lots of social commitments? All these extraneous things. How much energy do you actually have to give to training? Because we've got a limited pool of resources from which to pull to actually exert ourselves in the gym, and we want our efforts in the gym to add to rather than detract from our lifestyle. So if you can't even attend any social events because you're that fucked from the gym, is it really worth it? Probably not. And are you going to get burnt out and actually not reach your full potential? Quite highly likely, yes. So let's consider all that, and then you've got to look at genetic component. What sort of sporting background did you have when you were younger? If you got exposed to those high volumes when you were younger, then you probably can tolerate those high volumes and actually benefit from them. But if you actually hadn't, you can increase your work capacity to a certain degree. But if you haven't got a huge base of sporting for hours and hours a week, sporting work for hours and hours a week growing up, then, you might have to be realistic about how much training can you actually recover and tolerate from, and you may have to be a little bit more selective in your exercise selection and your programming and how much assistance work you do. And then, it's massively genetic as well. How much work you need to recover, how much frequency, how many sets, it's all, there's a big genetic component as well, and you have to look at yourself as an individual and not put any stock in what someone else is doing, because they might have a completely different set of genetics, a completely different lifestyle to you, and it's just comparing apples and oranges. It's just comparing, sorry, not apples and oranges. It's just comparing two completely different things. So yeah, all things to consider. Now let's look at an extreme example. So in about roughly it was like the 1980s, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, there was a powerlifting world champion called Mark Chalet. Now Mark had a very unique training program. On Monday he'd come in and he'd squat to a max for that week, and then he'd bench press to a max, then he'd leave the gym, and then he'd come back on Thursday and deadlift up to a max. And very little assistance work, if any. He did employ a little bit more in his younger years, but towards his most successful years, that was how he trained. okay? Essentially, no assistance work. Maybe the odd, there was a guy, Mighty Gallagher, who coached him to a certain extent, to the extent you can coach someone with almost minimal programming. He'd get him to actually periodise his weight up to a world championship. So they'd look at what he wanted to hit for his singles in comp, and they'd work backwards each week. And, he actually wouldn't train the entire year. When he had the world championships coming up, he would, they'd plan out this cycle, and Mark would be a flabby, 110 kilos or maybe even less, really sloppy. And then every week, just from these singles, get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the end of the training cycle, 2 to 3 months, he'd be an absolute beast, 120 plus kilos of pure muscle. And you can look up photos of him, so to see, he actually gained a huge amount of muscle just from literally 3 heavy singles a week. Though he was, hitting such heavy weights, over 1,000 pounds on a squat. He's, hit 400 kilo plus deadlifts many, many times in competition. It actually was a fair bit of work, even though it was singles, reaching up to those weights. Anyway, so I'm not saying that's the ideal training, but that's what Mark worked for him, and it appeared to have got him, at least close to his genetic potential. So it was probably, someone off. If it wasn't optimal, it was effective. And that's what you need to do, is not concern yourself with, your mate at the gym is doing 10 sets of squats or even more, he's squatting every day. You need to look at how much has my squat progressed in the last 3 months, and if it's not, let's change it. And a big thing you've got to realise is this will change abruptly, sometimes very abruptly, throughout your training career. So there was at one point, this was while I was still competing. There's one point in my strongman career. In the early stages, the first few years, I was squatting 6 times a week in addition to a full strongman prep, and my squat was going up dramatically. And now I squat once a week, and that's it. I could squat more times a week if I dropped deadlifts, but it's not worth it for me at this point. Once a week, I progress fine. Any less than that isn't good, but once a week is good. Likewise, I used to, I'd almost have to do a pressing movement 3-4 days a week to make any headway, it seemed, for years, to get my press to move whatsoever. And now I press once a week, and it's the best it's ever been, and I'm making great progress. So that is really something to think about. I mean, there were times, the first time I had a 225 kilo deadlift, I deadlifted 4 days a week. Now and very, very heavy. And now I deadlift heavy every second week. So that's another thing. You're always going to be adaptable to change, and as you get bigger, as you get stronger, the amount of training you do will have to be reduced. And this is something that when someone who comes to me and they're advanced and they've stalled, quite often it's because they're trying to run these same programs with high volume that they used to do, they used to get good results, and now they're so strong, it's actually making them weaker, or it's making them stagnant. And they'll look at this first program I send them, and they'll see, and I think, this isn't enough work for me to progress. And I'm like, just trust it, let's give it a go. And then they tell me how good they're feeling, how they're progressing every week. And I'm like, yeah. So, and then I explain to them, well, what's happened is, you've trained for so many years, now one of your sets is like 3 sets, 5 years ago, It's maybe like, one of your sets now is maybe the equivalent of 10 sets 10 years ago, So that's how much effort you're putting in. So you're not actually training less hard, you're actually training harder than you ever have before. Just on paper, it looks like you're not. So that you've got to explain it to people, and they've just got to essentially get over it if they want to progress. They've got to not be tied into how many sets they're doing, because that's just an arbitrary number. You've just got these preconceived notions in your head about how much work needs to be done to get this result, which are constantly changing. The needs of your body are constantly changing, so that's going to change over time. And it's arbitrary. you shouldn't have any preconceived notions about your program at all. It should be purely results based. So that brings us back to the start. So just, if there's anything you take away from this video, constantly check yourself to see if you're a stimulus addict. So even though I'm on a fairly low volume program, I'll sometimes have to pull things back, deload, adjust things, and make changes, because it's still possible for me to overtrain. And I'm constantly seeing how little what's the least amount of training I can get away with and still get the result I want. Because if I do the maximal amount of training, there's going to be that fatigue. And every extra rep you do, it's just more stress on your joints that is potentially, and that's more work to recover from. You're digging the hole deeper, the recovery hole, making more inroads into recovery. And what we want to do is get the stimulus and then exit the gym, grow and recover and get better. So let's think about this concept. Make sure you're not a stimulus addict, and comment below, tell me what you think of the video. Out.